The story of Cain and his wife unfolds in the early chapters of the Bible in the book of Genesis. It is a narrative shrouded in mystery as the scriptures provide limited details, leaving readers to ponder several unanswered questions. Today, let's dive into the Bible to uncover the spiritual significance of Cain and his wife. And if you love content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and watch until the end. In the beginning, God, with infinite love and creativity, formed Adam, the first man, from the dust of the earth. He breathed life into Adam, making him a living being. God placed Adam in the Garden of Eden, a paradise filled with every kind of tree that was pleasant to the sight and good for food. In this perfect garden, Adam was given the responsibility to tend and keep it, enjoying unhindered fellowship with God. However, seeing that Adam was alone, God declared, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." So God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep, and from his side he created Eve, the first woman. Together, Adam and Eve were the pinnacle of God's creation, made in his image and entrusted with dominion over the earth. But paradise didn't last. Adam and Eve disobeyed God by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a tree God had commanded them to avoid. Their disobedience brought sin and its consequences into the world. As a result, they were expelled from Eden to live in a world where survival would require toil and pain would become a part of life. Cain's birth. After leaving Eden, Adam and Eve began their life in the harsh realities of the outside world. Amidst this new chapter, God blessed them with children. Their firstborn son, Cain, brought them joy and hope for the future. Eve exclaimed, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Little did they know that Cain's life would be marked by trials and choices that would shape humanity's history. As Cain grew, he became a farmer, learning to till the ground and grow crops. He worked the soil diligently, providing food for his family. The earth, though now cursed because of Adam's sin, yielded its produce under Cain's labor. Cain's hands became familiar with the rough texture of the plow, and his days were filled with sweat and effort. He found pride in his work, cultivating the land that God had created. The arrival of Abel. Not long after Cain's birth, Adam and Eve were blessed with another son, Abel. While Cain devoted himself to farming, Abel chose a different path. He became a shepherd, tending to flocks and caring for animals. The brothers grew up side by side, learning from their parents about God's creation, the joy of work, and the consequences of disobedience. The two brothers, though different in their pursuits, were united in their heritage as the firstborn of humanity. They lived in a world that was both beautiful and broken, a reflection of their parents' fall from grace. The choices they would make would set the stage for humanity's ongoing struggle between obedience to God and rebellion against him. As the years passed, Cain and Abel grew into men, each devoted to his own work. Cain, the firstborn, tended to the soil, cultivating crops and harvesting the fruits of the ground. Abel, his younger brother, became a shepherd, caring for flocks and guiding them through pastures. Despite their differences in work, both brothers recognized the need to honor the Lord for his provision. One day, they prepared offerings to present before God. Abel carefully selected the finest portions from the firstborn of his flock, choosing the best and healthiest animals. His offering reflected a heart of faith and deep reverence for God. Cain, on the other hand, gathered fruits from his harvest. While his offering was from the ground he worked so hard to cultivate, It lacked the spirit of true devotion and faith that God desired. When the Lord regarded Abel's offering with favor, it was a moment of joy and affirmation for Abel, but for Cain, God's lack of regard for his offering felt like a sharp wound. He couldn't understand why his work had not been accepted, and instead of looking inward to examine his heart, he grew resentful. Jealousy and anger. Cain's heart burned with jealousy. Each day his anger festered and grew, casting a shadow over his relationship with his brother. Abel's peace and favor with God only served to deepen Cain's bitterness. One day, as Cain brooded over his feelings, the Lord spoke to him. "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." God's words were a loving warning, a chance for Cain to turn away from the bitterness taking root in his soul. But Cain allowed his anger to take hold, ignoring God's gentle guidance. Fratricide. In his bitterness, Cain devised a plan. He approached Abel one day with a calm demeanor, masking his true intentions. "Let's go out to the field," he suggested casually. Abel, unsuspecting of any danger, agreed and followed his brother. Once they were alone in the open field, Cain's jealousy and anger boiled over. Overcome by rage, he attacked Abel, striking him down. Abel, the faithful and innocent, lay lifeless in the field. The act was the first murder, a tragic stain on humanity's story. Cain, the son of Adam and Eve, had committed a grievous sin, allowing hatred to consume him. The ground, which he had so diligently worked, now bore witness to his brother's blood. One day, after Cain and Abel had made their offerings to God, something went terribly wrong. Abel's offering was accepted by God because it was made with a pure heart, but Cain's offering was rejected. This made Cain angry and jealous of his brother. God saw Cain's heart and warned him that sin was crouching at his door, urging him to choose what was right. But Cain didn't listen. His jealousy led him to do something terrible. He lured Abel out into the field and killed him. The act of murder brought darkness into the world, and God was deeply grieved by Cain's sin. Later, God confronted Cain. He asked, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain, trying to hide his guilt, responded with a question of his own, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Cain's words showed that he didn't take responsibility for his actions, and his heart had become hardened. God, who sees all things, knew exactly what had happened. He told Cain that the blood of Abel cried out to him from the ground. God then pronounced a curse upon Cain. He would no longer find peace or stability in the land, and the ground that once yielded crops would no longer give him its full strength. Cain would become a restless wanderer, moving from place to place, unable to settle down or find peace. Cain, overwhelmed by the weight of his punishment, feared that others might seek to harm him, seeing him as a murderer. But God, in his mercy, didn't leave Cain to face the world alone. To protect him, God placed a special mark on Cain, a sign that would warn others not to harm him. This mark was a symbol of God's mercy, even in the face of judgment. So Cain was sent away to live in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Though he was cursed and would wander for the rest of his life, God's mercy followed him in the form of protection. It was a reminder that even when we face the consequences of our actions, God's love and mercy are never far behind. Through judgment, God offered a chance for Cain to reflect, and through mercy, he protected him. This story teaches us that God is just, and he does not overlook sin, but he is also full of mercy. Even when we make mistakes, God's grace can still shine through, offering protection, hope, and the opportunity to change. After Cain's confrontation with God, a heavy silence fell upon him. The weight of his actions and the curse that followed him was almost unbearable. God had given him a mark for protection, but Cain knew he could no longer stay where he once called home. The familiar land of Eden, with its lush beauty and peace, now seemed distant and cold. With a heavy heart, Cain turned his back on it, leaving the presence of the Lord. As he walked away from the Garden of Eden, a sense of isolation filled him. His feet moved slowly at first, but then with a certain resolve, he journeyed eastward to a place known as Nod. The land was barren and wild, different from the garden where life had once been abundant. But for Cain, this exile became the beginning of a new chapter. The land of Nod was not a place of rest or comfort, it was a land of wandering. Yet in the midst of his punishment, Cain became the founder of a new line of humanity. His descendants would rise from the dust of this place, and though their names would be tied to Cain's shame, they would also shape the future. Cain began to build cities, creating something out of nothing, a testament to his will to survive. Cain's departure to Nod was more than just physical. It was a turning point in his heart. Though he was haunted by the memory of his brother Abel and the crime he had committed, he pressed on, establishing a legacy that would endure. But his story was one of contrasts, judgment and mercy, sorrow and resolve. As Cain settled in Nod, he knew his life would never be the same. He could no longer walk with God in the cool of the day like before. But in his exile, God's mercy followed him, showing that even in the midst of punishment, a new beginning could emerge. The mark of protection was a reminder that God's grace could still be found, even in the darkest places. And so, Cain's journey continued, not just as a wanderer, but as the father of a new generation who would live in the land of Nod, a land of both exile and hope, a land where the future was uncertain but still full of possibilities. In the quiet, desolate land of Nod, where Cain had wandered and built his new life, there was a change. As Cain sought to establish his legacy, the weight of his exile still pressed upon him. But in the midst of his loneliness, God allowed Cain to meet someone, a woman who would become his wife. The Bible gives us only a brief glimpse of this moment. We are told that Cain had a wife, but her name and background are never revealed. The details of her identity remain a mystery, wrapped in the silence of ancient history. However, we can gather a few clues from the scriptures and the context of Cain's time. Cain's wife likely came from a family that shared the same bloodline, as all humans descended from Adam and Eve. In a world still in its early stages, the boundaries of family and tribe were not as they would be in later generations. At that time, it was not unusual for siblings to marry one another in order to preserve the human race. So Cain's wife may have been one of his sisters, or perhaps a close relative from the line of Adam and Eve, joining Cain in his new life in Nod. Though we do not know her name or the specific details of her life, it's possible that she, too, was burdened with the weight of her family's past. The murder of Abel had left a mark on Cain's heart, and perhaps this woman shared in that sorrow, knowing the burden of Cain's legacy. Yet, despite the shadow of his crime, Cain's wife chose to stand by him. She was part of his story, walking beside him in a land far from Eden, shaping a future with him. As the years passed, Cain and his wife would go on to have children, and their family grew. Though they were far from the peace of Eden, They began to build a new life. The birth of their son would be a sign of hope, a sign that even in exile life could go on. Cain's wife, though unnamed and unknown in many ways, played an essential part in the beginning of humanity's story, becoming the mother of the first generation born outside of Eden. Her story is largely untold, but it's clear that she was more than just a footnote in Cain's life. She shared in the burden of exile and the hope of new beginnings. Together, they faced a future uncertain, but full of possibility. Cain's journey in the land of Nod had been long and filled with hardship. As he wandered, the weight of his past, the murder of his brother Abel, always followed him. But in the quiet of his exile, something new and precious began to take shape. One day, Cain's wife gave birth to their first son, a boy named Enoch. The child's arrival marked a turning point in Cain's life. He held his son in his arms, a symbol of new life and hope in a world that had become so lonely and desolate. For the first time since the fall of Eden, Cain saw something pure, something that wasn't tainted by the sin he had committed. Enoch was a blessing, a reminder that despite the darkness of his past, there was still room for love and new beginnings. Cain's heart, though still burdened with the memories of his past, began to look forward. He saw his son as a fresh start, a chance to build a future that wouldn't be defined by his mistakes, but by the legacy he could create with his family. The building of a city Cain was determined to not let his curse define him forever. He might have been marked as a wanderer, but he refused to remain a drifter in a foreign land. Inspired by his love for Enoch and his desire to make something lasting, Cain began the work of building a city. It was a massive task, one that required hard work, planning, and patience. With the help of his family and the resources available to him in Nod, Cain built a strong, protective city, a place where people could live in safety. This city became his pride, a place where he could lay down roots and leave behind something more than just a memory. Cain named the city after his son, Enoch. It was a tribute to the life and future Enoch represented. In this city, Cain hoped to establish a lasting legacy, something that would outlive him and his troubled past. The legacy of Enoch. As the city began to take shape, Cain found a sense of purpose. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a father, a builder, and a leader. In naming the city after Enoch, Cain dedicated his efforts to his son's future, to the promise of what would come after him. It was his way of showing that even in exile, even with the weight of his past sin, he could create something good. Cain's city, though small at first, became a symbol of perseverance. It was more than just a physical structure. It was the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's story. It was a sign that even in the darkest of times, hope could grow and the future could be shaped by the choices made today. Cain's story, though filled with sorrow and regret, is also one of redemption and hope. Despite his punishment, he built a life for his son and created a future for his descendants. His efforts show that even in exile, a man can create something lasting, and through Enoch, Cain's legacy would live on. After Cain settled in the land of Nod, he began to build a life for himself and his family. His son Enoch was the first of Cain's descendants. Enoch's birth brought a new sense of purpose to Cain's life. As the years passed, Enoch grew, and eventually he had a son of his own, Irad, the grandson of Cain, became a key figure in the growing family line. He too had children, and one of them, Mehujael, would continue the family legacy. Mehujael was a man who carried the weight of his lineage with him, but was also determined to make his own mark on the world. Mehujael fathered Methushael, a man known for his strength and leadership, who later became the father of Lamech. Lamech, unlike his ancestors, would leave a significant imprint on the world with his bold actions and vision for the future. Lamech, the great-great-grandson of Cain, had children who became famous for their contributions to society. One of his sons, Jubal, became the father of all who play the harp and flute, bringing music into the world. Another of Lamech's sons, Tubal-Cain, was a skilled worker in bronze and iron, teaching humanity how to shape metal and create tools that would revolutionize life. Lamech's daughters, too, played their part. Their contributions, although less mentioned, were just as significant in establishing the foundation for the coming generations. Through their wisdom and strength, they helped create a family legacy that would persist through the ages. Although Cain's family had been marked by his sin, the descendants of Cain, especially through Lamech, began to transform the world in ways no one could have predicted. Despite their beginnings, they contributed to the building of culture, tools, and music, leaving behind a legacy of invention and progress. Cain's legacy, marked by both progress and destruction, tells a complex story. On one hand, Cain's descendants contributed to the development of civilization with advancements in tools, music, and animal husbandry. Lamech, the great-great-grandson of Cain, stood out as a prominent figure in this lineage. His sons brought new technologies and cultural innovations to the world. Jubal, for example, brought music into human life, playing the harp and flute, while Tubal-Cain pioneered the art of working with bronze and iron. Through these inventions, Cain's descendants helped shape the early foundations of human culture. Yet, alongside these achievements, Cain's family was marked by moral failings. Lamech's actions in particular stand out for their moral ambiguity. He took 2 wives, an act that furthered the sin of polygamy, a practice that was never part of God's original design. But perhaps more troubling was Lamech's pride and violence. He spoke to his wives of a man he had killed, boasting that he was avenging himself 77 times. His words revealed a heart hardened by violence and arrogance, a clear contrast to the humble and repentant spirit that God had shown to Cain in the past. The story of Cain's descendants provides a vivid example of human progress mixed with sin. It shows the complexity of humanity, our ability to innovate and build, but also our capacity for pride, violence, and disobedience. Cain's family reflects the struggle of mankind, moving forward in some ways, but often stumbling in others. In stark contrast to Cain's line, however, is the lineage of Seth, Cain's younger brother. Seth's line represents a different path, a line marked by faithfulness and a return to God's design. Seth's descendants were the ones who called on the name of the Lord, Genesis 4:26. Among them was Enoch, a man who, like his father, honored God. Seth's line continued through Noah, who found favor with God and was saved from the flood. Ultimately, Seth's lineage led to the birth of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. While Cain's descendants contributed to human progress, their story is also a warning about the dangers of pride, violence, and disobedience. The contrast with Seth's line shows that true progress is not just about cultural achievements, but also about faithfulness to God. Seth's line is the one through which God's promises were fulfilled, leading to the salvation of humanity through Christ. Cain's story in the Bible teaches us important lessons about sin, justice, mercy, and the early development of human civilization. His life is a reflection of the struggles humanity faces as we wrestle with our weaknesses, our decisions, and our relationship with God. At the heart of Cain's story is his jealousy, a feeling that grew so powerful it led him to commit the first murder in history. His jealousy of his brother Abel, whose offering was accepted by God, overshadowed his own heart. Instead of learning from his mistake or seeking reconciliation, Cain allowed his anger to consume him. This led to the tragic moment where he murdered Abel in the fields. Cain's actions didn't just result in Abel's death. His sin led to his own exile from the land where he had once lived with his family. God cast him away to wander in a land called Nod. This exile was a direct consequence of Cain's sin. His punishment wasn't just about physical separation. It was about the emotional and spiritual isolation that sin brings into a person's life. While Cain's sin was grave, God's response to him was far more complex than simple punishment. God's justice was evident in the punishment Cain received. But his mercy was also clear. God placed a mark on Cain to protect him from being killed by others. This mark was a sign of God's mercy, showing that while Cain had sinned, he was still under God's care. Even in the midst of punishment, God extended grace and provided a way for Cain to live, though he would bear the consequences of his actions. This act of mercy is a powerful reminder that God's justice is never without his mercy. Though we all make mistakes and sometimes face the consequences of our actions, God is always there, offering us his grace if we turn to him. Cain's mark stands as a reminder that even in our darkest moments, God's mercy can be seen, and there's always an opportunity for redemption. Cain's story also offers insight into the early development of human society. After the murder of Abel, Cain left his family behind and wandered in the land of Nod. But rather than merely wandering aimlessly, Cain eventually built a city. He named the city after his son, Enoch, marking a significant milestone in human civilization. This act of building a city was the beginning of human society, a reflection of mankind's desire to create and build something lasting even after a great sin. In the City of Enoch, Cain's descendants went on to develop new skills, inventions, and culture. For instance, his great-great-grandson Lamech had children who contributed to advancements in tools, music, and animal husbandry. These early developments helped lay the foundation for the more complex societies that would follow. Cain's descendants were pioneers in the development of civilization, showing that even in the face of sin, human beings have the ability to create, innovate, and build something meaningful. Cain's life is a story of deep consequences and lessons that resonate through history. When Cain offered his sacrifices to God, he was rejected, not because of the sacrifice itself, but because of the condition of his heart. God gave him a chance to repent, but Cain's jealousy of Abel boiled over. That jealousy transformed into something darker: murder. In a field far from his parents, Cain killed his brother. The very first murder, a direct result of unchecked jealousy. But even in the aftermath of this tragedy, God did not abandon Cain. The Bible tells us that after Cain killed Abel, God came to him asking, "Where is your brother?" Instead of confessing, Cain lied. But God knew the truth and issued a curse upon Cain, sentencing him to wander. Cain was to live as a fugitive, cast away from the land where he once lived. He would face hardship, a punishment that mirrored the weight of his sin. Yet Cain was not left without mercy. God placed a mark on Cain, a divine protection. This mark was a sign that Cain would not be killed by anyone seeking revenge. It was a reminder that even in punishment, God's mercy is present. He was not forsaken, even in the midst of his wrongdoing. In the land of Nod, Cain's story took another turn. Rather than living in despair, Cain settled down and began to build a city. This city, named after his son Enoch, was the first city in human history. It represented a shift from mere survival to the creation of culture and civilization. Cain's descendants, including his great-great-grandson Lamech, contributed greatly to society. They developed music, new technologies, and tools that would shape the world for generations to come. While Cain's legacy is marred by sin, his story also shows the power of human innovation and the ongoing work of civilization. His descendants built cities, invented tools, and discovered ways to sustain life, but they also struggled with sin. Lamech's pride and violent speech revealed the darkness that still lingered in Cain's family. It was a reminder that even in the midst of progress, the temptation to sin remains.